So, as a fortunate or unfortunate member, or rather ex-member of a society that has experienced and time and again experiencing liberation movements, not really and truly successful to reach a more liberated society, coming across a book with the title Theorie der Befreiung, a theory of liberation, Nazariye Rahai, could not be simply overlooked. It could of course be disputed whether the status of a society still living under the rule of the Islamic Republic has not changed after a liberation attempt. However, standing shortly before the second anniversary of the Jina uprising under the motto Jeune Jian Azadi, and a little after the 14th presidential election in Iran, watching the state seemingly sovereign by all means of violence and suppression, huge number of physical injuries, imprisonments, and executions. Nothing sounds more essential, I dare say, than looking back and at the same time forward to the experiences of liberation in that political geography through different theoretical mediums. Not least important is the reflection on the concept of liberation per se. In fact, this question has never been outdated. What is liberation? Liberation from what to what and by whom? Is the liberation something we deliberately do or something befalling us? And nonetheless, the relation between the liberation, Befreiung, and freedom, Freiheit. Obviously, we won't be able to address all these questions at length in this session with Christoph Menke. We would but try to approach some of them mostly by focusing on the aesthetics of liberation, the first chapter of the book, Theorie der Befreiung. For the audience here, I would like to introduce Christoph Menke, by whom I personally learned a lot during my studies at this university, and I'm still learning. Since 2009, Christoph Menke is the professor of practical philosophy here at the Goethe University with the focus on practical philosophy and philosophy of rights. He is a major representative of the third generation of Frankfurt School, and his intellectual work covers various fields of philosophy. One major area almost present in his work is aesthetics. According to the last sentence in the book, forth a fundamental concept of aesthetic anthropology, published 2008 in German, 2012 in English. The last word of aesthetics is human freedom. For my last words, I would like to mention some of the recent books of Christoph Menke here. The major work, Critique of Rights, 2015 in German, 2020 in English. Autonomy and Liberation, 2018 in German. On the Day of Crisis, 2018 in German. And the current book, A Theory of Liberation, 2022 in German. The good news is that this latest work, which is also our subject of discussion here, has already been translated into Farsi, and soon will be published by National in Iran. And at this point, I pass the word on to André Möller.
Hello. I would like to start our discussion with the diagnosis at the beginning of the book. Namely that we live in a time of failed liberations. And I think it is very important that by failure you do not mean that the forces of oppression have up to now simply proven stronger, though sometimes they do, but you mean something much more fundamental by that. So you say it is the form of our liberation, what you call the Western form of liberation, that fails. Because it reproduces domination. And I would first like to ask, how do you understand that form and why is it bound to fail?
Yeah, thank you for the question, but first of all, thank you to the organizers who have invited me. for the opportunity to speak here and to discuss with both of you. Thank you for preparing this so well. So I know already what I will be asked. So that is very convenient. And let me right away start with the question. So maybe before I come to the answer, I maybe have to say something. Let's say methodological remark, because the question I think that you raised that is the question with which I start the book, can only be asked if we understand liberation not just as a term to describe, and not only as a normative term, as the term articulating our wishes or hopes or prospects or goals or so directed to the future. But if we understand liberation also as an explanatory term by which we try to explain to ourselves our present situation. So the claim with which the book starts is that it does not make sense anymore to simply continue to proclaim that liberation is a good thing and that it is necessary, that we should try to do it. That's also right. Yeah? But we also have to see, and when I speak of we here now, I mainly think of, let's say, the half or semi-liberal Western society. So how this would look like from an Iranian perspective in order to understand the Iranian situation is a different question that I would find very interesting to discuss with you later. But if you look at our situation here, let's say the Western societies, we can only understand the forms of oppression and the forms of violence and domination if we understand them already as the outcome of processes of liberation. So liberation is not the future, liberation is our past also. Yeah? So liberation always already has taken place when we start to ask the question how true liberation can take place, right? And in that sense, if we use liberation also as an explanatory term in order to get a better understanding of our current present situation, then that is the suggestion at the beginning of the book. We have to understand why the current forms of domination have been produced in a sense as a counter effect, but not contingently by certain forms of liberation. Yeah? So, I mean, for instance, the bourgeois revolutions of the late 18th century were, of course, forms of liberation. I mean, you don't have to be a liberal to think that. You also can be a Marxist to think that. Yeah? So this is how Marx describes bourgeois revolutions. They are, of course, forms of liberation, but of course they have produced new forms of domination. And the relation between the form of liberation there and the form of domination that is produced is not a contingent one, I want to say. It's a structural one. Yeah? So in that sense, I think that is just in order to explain why I think we have to ask about the formal structure of what we understood by liberation, what we have practiced as liberations in the past in order to understand our present condition, and in order to maybe then think about an alternative way of proceeding. Yeah? So that is the frame, in a certain sense, of my question, of that session.
Okay, so this is also why you say that liberation has always has to fight two fights at once. So one fight against oppression and one fight against itself. Right.
So the dialectic of liberation is precisely that. If everything would be easy, yeah. So if there were an external opposition between domination and freedom and domination and liberation, then it would be difficult to win that fight, but at least we would know where the enemy is. Yeah. So, but the problem is that liberation movements have proven to be their own enemy. Yeah? So to obstruct themselves internally. So there's an internal dialectic here. So that in a sense one would, I think, need to say that any true liberation would be a liberation from liberation, yeah? From the wrong form of liberation that has shaped our current forms of domination.
So the liberation from liberation and the liberation of liberation.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, even more complicated. Liberation from domination, liberation from liberation, liberation of liberation. Yeah. So the liberation from liberation is, in my view, not the erasure or the defeatistic giving up on the concept of liberation, on the goal of liberation, but rather try to find the better form or the true form of liberation. So it's, in that sense, a pessimistic account of present liberation and an optimistic account of possible liberations.
Maybe back to my question from the beginning. So what went wrong? Or what is going wrong?
I think, that is a complex question, and I will only try to give a very simplistic kind of answer. I think one problem of the traditional Western concept of liberation is, in a certain sense, the way in which it conceived itself as self-liberation. Because that raises the question, who is the subject of liberation? And who are we, or how are we, when we try to perform liberation as our own subjective deed? Because the way in which we are subject and the conditions under which we have been constituted as subjects were or are under forms of domination. So the subject is not exempt from the form of domination, rather is the effect or the product of forms of domination. So the subject is the outcome of domination. And how then can that same subject that has been produced under conditions and by forms of domination be the subject of its own liberation? I think that is the deep problem of the traditional understandings of revolution, of liberation in the Western tradition, and maybe the problem that all traditional forms of revolution, from the bourgeois revolutions through the Soviet revolution to the cultural revolutions of the 1960s, share and have in common. None of them really were able to address the problem where the subject of liberation actually comes from, if it cannot just be the subject as it has been formed, constituted, produced under forms of domination. So the subject of liberation cannot be presupposed to liberation, so it has to be the outcome of liberation. But who then performs the liberation if the subject that is making the agent of liberation is at the same time its own product? That is the paradoxical circle, one could say, in which traditional forms of revolution and liberation have found themselves. And this is not just a theoretical problem; it's a practical problem. Because if the new form, the free form of a society, of culture, and so on, is just built by the same kind of agency that has been formed under traditional forms of domination, in a certain sense, it is doomed to repeat that form of domination which it was meant to overcome.
That's the reason why you think you have to have this theory is a theory in retrospect. So you talk about a theory in retrospectively. You say that a theory of liberation is always a theory in retrospect, in Rückblick.
Yeah.
So does it have to do with, do you mean it in this way? You think that since we are always, we have to look back to be able to make a theory of liberation, or our theory of liberation is always something in Rückblick, in retrospect. So in what way, or what does it bring to look back to the versagte, to not successful liberation attempts?
I think it has a double meaning. I don't really remember what I say exactly at that point in the book, but who cares? I think the retrospect shows us two things, or maybe two opposite things. First of all, I think, as already said to André, that we need a critical re-evaluation of the forms of liberation that we have experienced. We means, again, my society, my kind of society in the last 200 years, in order to understand why the failures of those forms of liberation, as I just said, are not just contingent, but have to do something with a very deep problem in the way of making those forms of revolution and liberation. So that, which I just tried to redescribe as this paradoxical nature. But the retrospect also shows us something else. Yeah. So I don't want to say that the forms of subjectivity that we embody and that we practice all the time, just the product of forms of domination. I think they are also necessarily internally split. So I only can become habituated in a certain way. I only can become subject-divided, if one can say this, in a certain form, because I'm habituable. Yeah? I'm someone who can be educated, who can be trained, who can be formed in a specific way. And this possibility of being trained in a specific way, I want to say, always entails the possibility of being formed otherwise or differently. So there's an interplay, I want to say, in the formation of subjectivity between forms of domination that address the subject from outside and a certain kind of, I say this, aesthetic potential, of potentiality, of possibility, one could say, that is in itself the possibility of being formed in that way, but therefore we can always return to the initial situation of this primary, preliminary situation and potentiality in order to start differently and anew. So the retrospect shows me two things. It shows me the extreme extent to which I am as a subject formed by forms of domination, and it shows me the aesthetic counterforce, the aesthetic counterpotential that allows one opening towards a different future.
I would maybe come back to the paradox that you explained that lies in liberation when the capability that we need to be liberated comes from oppression. We get these capabilities under oppression because for many theories this is not a paradox but a solution. They say the revolution is possible, and precisely because, for example, the workers work together in the factories and they get many what's it called, Vermögen, capacities, and this makes liberation possible, and otherwise it's impossible because who could be the actor? So this is a very radical point. It breaks with a lot of theories of liberation that we are familiar with.
Yeah, this is the idea. So that the central term in my understanding for answering the question, is the term you just introduced, is the term of capacities or habits. Yeah? So a subject is not something who knows itself, but the subject is somebody who can do something, who is able to do something, who has capacities. And these capacities, as I want to say, are always formed under certain conditions. They're the result of being addressed in a certain way, of being trained in a certain way, of being educated in a certain way. And I try to show in the book in what sense in the logical structure of those capacities are formed by a certain logic of identity, a certain logic of automatic repetition, and therefore always have a dimension of unfreedom. They make me able to do things, but they make me able to do things in a specific way, and that specific way, the specificity of any capacity is always preformed by these forms of social control and domination. But at the same time, as I said, I don't think that subjectivity can simply be identified with a set of capacities. And there's not a finite set of capacities that define me as a subject, but there's always also, and necessarily so, not for contingent reasons again, but contingent reasons don't exist for contingency, a certain kind of potentiality that exceeds the predetermined form of my capacities. And this dimension, I would suggest not call a capacity, but rather, Agamben would call it potentiality, I would call it a force. And that is the connection with what Yeganeh said before with the discourse of aesthetics.
Yeah, so maybe you could explain a little bit further this aesthetic force. I mean, in the book you call it a fascination. So the alternative model is based on fascination, and maybe you could explain a little bit this how what you call radical liberation differs from the Western model of liberation.
I mean, if you grant me for a moment that idea, right, that subjects and subjectivities are not entirely defined by a socially determined set of capacities, but that there is always an exceeding potential, an exceeding force, right? Then the question is, how do I, in a sense, that how do I have that force? I mean, do I own it? Yeah? Certainly, I didn't learn it. But in a sense, I want to say that force only becomes active and is only visible and relevant in experiences. And so one could say it's my most inner force, but it always comes from outside. So, and this I understand as the idea of aesthetic experience, and I take the extreme example of the situation of fascination. So, in the moment I'm fascinated by a certain person, by a certain deed, by a certain event, by a certain appearance in the world, in a certain sense, that world, that socially defined world, is opening up. There's a gap in that world. So that opens. So experience is always the moment when I do not simply recognize something as something in the way I always do, but experience is the moment when I'm confronted with something that, in a certain sense, does not have yet a determinate shape, does not yet have a determinate meaning, but rather is a moment of possibility, a moment of openness. And in experience, I get to that point, right? So that's where I risk my categories, I risk my traditional forms of acting and reacting to certain things. And as I said, there's a gap in the world opening up. And experience is the moment of that gap. And experience, therefore, is the moment in which, in the encounter of something in the world, I'm able to act otherwise and to proceed otherwise.
So the sentence in the book, the liberation that is merely experienced degenerates into a break. So the habit is interrupted for a moment and then it goes back, it goes on as before. So I would say actually in a macroscopic view, it's just it is actually the key problematic of each uprising we watched in the last years. But in a microscopic view, I doubt that it goes actually as before. It could even go as before. But the experience of fascination, according to your text, has to become liberation. And this becoming is possible by preserving the memory. Otherwise, it would be mere aesthetics. To remain true to the liberation experience through fascination, we need firstly to think the liberation, and secondly to change the way we determine things. So, would you please explain a little bit more? Yeah, sure. What are these two moments somehow?
Yeah, I can try. So, I mean, the question I asked myself at that point of the book is there not a danger also in this very enthusiastic, one could say, and affirmative idea that by experience, in aesthetic experiences, the predeterminations of our world are shattered, and a possibility of the new opens up, and so on and so on. Yeah, because we are part of the history of liberation of Western society is that there were always these aesthetic movements, right? So, which were trusting on those moments of shock and interruption and disruption and so on and so on. This where the new apparently showed up, and in the end nothing changed. Yeah. So that is, I mean, where these interruptions and disruptions merely were negative events in a certain sense of opening for a moment an alternative way of looking at things, at experience and sensing things, but things didn't change. Yeah. So, and that shows, I think, that one needs, in a certain sense, in my view, an aesthetic ground for liberation, but liberation cannot be defined aesthetically. Yeah? So it cannot stay mere experience. And the material with which I tried to think that through a little bit is the discussion about surrealism that we had in the 20s and the 30s. There's this famous article by Walter Benjamin on surrealism where he says, okay, surrealism is all fine. Yeah, it's a very radical idea of freedom that they practice, but they didn't solve the problem of how to unite the forces of revolt, he says, with an actual, what he calls revolutionary transformation of the world. They only stayed in that field of experience of the arts. In the end, it ended where all the arts end, in the museum. Yeah? And the museum can be a nice place, yeah, for aesthetic experience, but the moment you leave the museum, the world outside, the factory, the police, the state is the same. Yeah? So that is the question, how can we start from there, but really start from there? Yeah? And I think I try to, not in a prescriptive way, but just thinking through some examples, try to identify certain elements, yeah, of what would us enable to go further, yeah, and really start from there. And I think one element that is important, and I think if we watch the film later, so we'll see this at some moment. We've had a little film which is really telling, I think, is it needs a certain kind of courageous decision, yeah, an act of courage, yeah, namely to say this has not just been a transitory experience in which I felt well and good and happy for the first time in my life, maybe, but to think about, to decide, to think from that experience and to try to answer the question, what does it mean? And what are the possible consequences of my ability to make such an experience, to have such an experience? It must change my view of myself and my view of the world, right? And that is an act of, I think it's an act of courage. It needs a lot of courage to say that and to confront that moment, not let it pass by. Yeah, so as we always do, I always do, go to the opera, great moments, go home, yeah, and nothing is different. Yeah, but it needs courage to say no. If I really think and look at the world from that moment, the world would have to look differently. Yeah. And that needs new thinking, as people said. It needs decision and courage. And I think this is, certainly a moment missing in the book and underdeveloped. Even I think I didn't really see this in the book. I think maybe that's also the moment where one would have to think about collectivities. Yeah, because the book is, in a sense, very individualistic in the form of reflection, as if liberation was something that takes place in myself, for myself, by myself. But if I try to think about, also in reaction to criticisms, what enables me to make that step, that bold step from aesthetic experience to an actually liberation movement, that is something maybe that has not just individual preconditions, and maybe not even the individual is the scene of that step, but the individual in a collective. So I only can have the courage together with others. I mean, maybe even it's not even that courageous act of thinking anew if I just do it on my sofa alone, because that is not really thinking it.
With the last question, I would like to invite you to watch a short video, and many thanks to Siamak Mullah Mohammadi who made it for us. So we approach the memory of an experience fascination through narration, as you say. A narrative replaces sense-making and argumentative structures. According to the book, the narratives have to tell something unnarratable, das Unerzählbare, so that our thinking could find a starting point and break with the predetermined structures. In the video, we watched some moments of fascination experience in the liberation struggles over the last years in Iran. December 2017, Ida Mowahed, standing on a utility box on the Umara Street, Revolution Street, waving her scarf and making the non-existent figure of a woman without hijab visible to the passerby. An act which was repeated over and over with different women in many locations. We watched also scenes from the Yeganeh uprising, the mourning women in Archie Cemetery of Sakes with their skulls waved collectively in the air, or the gravestone of Yeganeh Amini with the well-known epitaph, Yeganeh Giantunameri, now with Abel Rams. A sentence still leaving, a shiver in the body, as if written by a prophetic hand. Several single scenes, obviously not all shown here, where people made themselves bravely far too vulnerable against oppressive forces. And the penultimate scene in Tabriz, where chanting death to dictator seems to give a rebellious body to azan, hasten to salvation, here and now. To go back to the discussion, I would like to underline the notion of the unnarratable, which means somehow undefinable too. Here's the realization of the liberation has to be political. We need to intervene. The predetermined social order, and this could happen only collectively. What would be the characteristics of a narrative which could serve as a collective liberal force? The big question.
Oof. No, because the question is so complicated, and because it's really going so deep, because the question for the narrative is at the same time the question for the action, because the narrative is just the narrative of the action. So if I knew what were the right form of the narrative, I also knew what the right action were, and then I would be a prophet myself. So maybe the prophet of the coming revolution. But no, but I think so. Therefore, I'm sure I cannot answer the question. But I think what I want to say with that, or what in the book is that that all true narratives of liberation, or narratives of true liberation, always have that structure that they begin with something and they return to something also continually, which cannot be, in that sense, not be narrated, because it's not the outcome of my own deliberate, strategic, intentional action. Yeah? So we return to a moment of experience, a moment in which something shows itself to me. It shows, for instance, it shows that this is wrong. And that is not something that
The narrative will later then relativize or justify, but it will always come back to that experience. Always, that is the power center, one could say, of each narrative of liberation. So there's always a power center there, a power ground, a potential that it revitalizes, that it reshapes and so on, but will never be able to replace. So we cannot replace that, but we have to return it. So therefore, liberation also, that is another aspect of what you said. At some point, why there is always a retrospective moment in liberation. There's always a moment of remembering. Yeah. So every act of liberation is remembering something and trying to reinscribe something that is remembered in the current situation. It's always cracking up the situation by going back to something. Yeah, that has a certain overabundant force or power that can never be replaced by reasons, by goals, by strategies, and so on, but rather is itself the ground for those. So something like that, I mean, yeah. So that the interplay between the narrative and the not narrativizable, I don't know if one can say this in English, but you know what I mean, event is a little bit similar to the dialectic between, and now I quote Adorno because we are in Frankfurt, between what he calls an impulse. Yeah? So an impulse, a drive, one could say in another language, and my reasons, my strategies, my goals, and so on. Yeah.
If you have any questions, we would open up. Okay, it's a lot.
My question is, why we think that the Iranian revolution is anything for liberation of the Sudan?
So you talked about the courage, fantastic, the connectivity and the collectiveness of the crowd and how it drives the individuals. But also, I think it needs to be much more. You need to look at it in a much more complex way. That the original story of pain, I think, it's one of those drives that push people to come to that moment of courage, to make that decision, to create that change. So in that regard, how do you play a role for pain in liberation in both sides, in Western countries as well as in other countries?
Thank you, Professor. I have tried. I started reading your book, and when you're talking about the whole definition of liberation as a form of basically trying to get out of domination, and why next after this I'm going to talk about actually that for a new social contract for Iran. We talked about the collectivity and how can we basically get out of this domination. And my question for you is, if Iranian wants to basically define our future, and how would we go about this domination? Because you talked about the possibility and potential of domination. And my point from the political structure is what kind of political structure we can develop to basically be able to determine its sources of domination in the society and be able to prevent this domination happening for the future. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't, if I have to say this, is I don't know nearly anything about Iran, at least so little that I'm the least one to answer your questions. Why should I be able to tell you something about understanding the Iranian situation and the Iranian history? I mean, that is rather something I would have to learn, I would like to learn from you. But I can only make some, philosophers don't know anything. So, I don't know. But we can just make, that might be disappointing for you, but make some very brief conceptual remarks, and then leave the answers to your questions to yourself. Yeah? So first of all, the first thing, you're actually right. I think no revolution is about liberation, about freedom. It's about something else. Yeah? It's about starvation. It's about justice. It's about whatever. Yeah? So, and it's driven by hate and all kinds of things. So, but it is a liberation. It's not about a liberation. Liberation is not a goal. Yeah? So, because then it would be I liberate because of liberation. Why should I? This is nonsensical. Yeah. So, no, this is what I do. Yeah. The moment I protest, I'm doing liberation. Even if of course I protest against something and I demand something. I demand bread. I demand the end of all kinds of repression and so on. That is something I demand. Yeah? And what do you demand in Iran? I don't know. Yeah? And I would not even wish to tell you what you should demand. But what I think is true is that whatever you demand is in demanding it and fighting for an act of liberation. So, you do liberation, whether you want or not, but you don't struggle for liberation, but the struggle is liberation. So that's the first remark. Question of pain, I think that's very important. And maybe all true motivations, and I don't think that there's anything bad about it, are negative for revolts. It's always against something. And if then the no betters tell you, no, you have to see something positive, you have to define the future. No, you can't. But you know for sure that this is how it should not go on. So, and this is out of pain, it's out of shame, out of hatred, and so on. And hatred is also not bad, it's a good thing. If you hate the right guys, it's a good thing. But I only wanted to say, and I think one sees this also in that film clips, right? That in the moment of protesting, in a sense that you experience it all for a moment of freedom. So not that freedom is something in the future to come. This is our American thing. Yeah? So, but freedom is present. Yeah? Freedom is present, but not in an institution, but in the moment on the street. Yeah? So there is, you only can fight in the name of freedom if you have experienced freedom, and if you are experiencing freedom. Of course, in an incomplete way, also in a way that drives you on. Yeah? But so I don't want to deny all these moments you described, but I also want to say, if there is not also in claiming that, in protesting, the experience of that you are free in that moment, the scarf burning, that is the expression of the moment of freedom, complete in itself. Yeah? So in that moment, those women are free. Yeah? So then the question is, how can they stay free? Yeah? How can they organize the freedom? And that is the third question. That is extremely difficult. Yeah? So to organize it, to turn this into a political structure, But the political structure would then be under the demand of preserving the memory of that freedom. Yeah. So, and in a certain sense, that is, because somebody mentioned prophecy before, in a certain sense, that is the logic of the prophetic political intervention. The prophet does not tell me what to do in the future, the prophet reminds me of what I truly am. That is what prophets do. So they don't speak about the future, they speak about the past and say, don't forget that moment in which you already were. Don't forget that moment. And a political institution that is strong enough, right, to embody that memory is the true one.
Thank you, Professor Menke. I enjoyed your discussion. I'm not a philosopher, but I'm just thinking of the definition of liberation. You told that's different from the European liberation. Is it possible to have a definition of naked or core of liberation, just to subtract everything, culture, history of European, and see added once the culture or history of other countries to see what's the outcome of that? Maybe that would be a mathematical model, just to define liberation based on the core or definition of a naked liberation. I'm sorry if I'm a stupid question, but yeah, thank you.
Pass it to the next one. Here. Okay, first of all, thanks a lot for this interesting conversation. Good there. And I just, philosophically have a question about the formula you presented, Dr. Menke, about the concept of liberation and this dialectic of liberation, from liberation. Okay. I don't know, but maybe I got such a sense based on your speech that there is a kind of cyclic timeline of liberation, or cyclic myth, maybe I can say, that reminds me that the myth of master-slave in Hegelian dialectics. But sorry for it was my perception. I felt it somehow this circular moment so fixated. That means because you said at the end of the process of liberation, we are in the beginning somehow, because the situation is the same, the domination, the oppression are the same, and can you just explain me? Is that, for example, in the Hegel himself, we can see somehow first of all, I can say, based on the regarding with this form of formula, it reminds me the concept of liberty as a Stoic method, like Stoic liberty. That you are liberty from your liberty. You are liberated from what you think about the liberty. Okay, and I think that was really Hegelian too, because Hegel just put that stage after the dialectic of master slave. But what would be the other step? Because with this circular time, I think we don't have any other steps. But in reality, in the history, in a more Christian way than the Greek way, I accuse to somehow the Greek position in this way. We could have this understanding of the history of liberation, the process. That means, yes, maybe we got failure, we couldn't change the situation grammatically, fundamentally, but we we got developed the consciousness.
Thank you. Briefly, I guess. So I think, I mean, in a sense, these are not questions. So because it's
the way in which you raise the question already entails the answers. I think first of all, I like your idea of the naked liberation very much, because in a sense that is what I want to say. I think we need to strip liberation from, in a certain sense, a cultural specific, a tradition, and so on, and think of liberation as something that is truly universal. Yeah. So, and I think, in a certain sense, I mean, of course, that is only a claim, and it can be disputed. But I think if we think from that aesthetic liberation from the beginning, or from the perspective of the aesthetic experience, we think of liberation as something that every human being, at every moment, in every culture, in every historical constellation, already has experienced. Now, there is no, that is the claim, there is no human being who has not experienced liberation in a moment of fascination. A human being who cannot be fascinated is not a human being, I would say. So, and therefore, I would say that is universal, because it's nearly empty, nearly naked, it's stripped of any specific determination, and therefore it's full of potentiality. That is the one. The other question is very complicated, and well, that's one too, but this is more complicated to answer, because I just very briefly want to say there are two forms of secularity, a bad and a good one. Yeah, and the bad one is that the subject that is to be liberated is already presupposed in liberation. That is a circularity which is mythical and so on, and against true progress. The circularity by which I want to replace is by saying acts of liberation come out of experiences of liberation. You already have to be liberated by experience in order to liberate yourself by acts. And that is the secularity which is productive, which is creative, which leads to the future, which opens new possibilities. So secularity is not the problem, it's the question which one.
And I want to thank you very much for the discussion with everybody.